We've been talking about medieval Europe and the medieval period. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the beginnings of Islam and some of the beliefs of Islam. If you remember that, I want to make sure that you are continuing to check MyFire and the videos that I post. It may be the fact that I post the videos that I have low enrollment in class, but we'll see. Anyway, be sure you sign the sign-in roll sheet. So a week or two ago, we talked about the beginnings of Islam, some of the basic beliefs. If you remember the 5 pillars of Islam and many of those things, you can go back and review those in your notes, or you can go back a couple of weeks. You could watch that online or look at the PowerPoint again that way. I want to talk about how Islam, how quickly it grows. We alluded to it during that talk, but I want to talk about it in a little more detail and how it makes an impact on Western Europe and really the rest of the world. So that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to say a little more about the Islamic world, the growth of Islam. Now, last time we talked about Islam, we talked about the early rise of Islam, and we talked about the 5 pillars of Islam, and we sort of ended with the death of Muhammad. Okay, and we just alluded to what happened after that. So today we're going to take a look at what happens after the death of Muhammad and how we actually see that Islam becomes divided. Islam has been divided for a long time. Today when we talk about Islam, we often talk about it as it's being just sort of one thing. There are people who are Muslims, and this is what they believe, and this is what they do. In fact, as you might suspect, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? There are certainly 2 huge branches within Islam. We're going to mention how that gets started today, a little bit about the differences. We're not going to go into it in great detail, but just enough so you will know some of that. Well, as you might remember from our discussion previously, Muhammad dies around the year AD 632. This will bring about a kind of, I don't know if I want to say a crisis, but certainly a problem within Islam. Islam started with the teachings, the revelations of Muhammad. Everything had focused around his work, his leadership. And when you think of Muhammad, you should think of someone who's not, you might think of him just as a religious leader, but he's not just a religious leader. He's also a political leader. He's also a military leader. He's also a judge, all that kind of thing, litigation and mediation. He's doing all that for the people and the community. But after his time, Islam will mushroom. It will grow quickly, and it'll face new challenges. One of the first challenges is, who is going to lead the Muslim people? They had a very powerful leader in Muhammad. And so we see, we see that this is one of their first challenges that they have. Who is going to lead Islam after Muhammad dies? And there was no good procedure for this because it had never happened before. And as you remember, Islam is a very patriarchal kind of society. So therefore, since Muhammad didn't have any sons, I think if he would have had a son or 2, then it would have perhaps obviously sort of gone to his son or perhaps his sons. Now, he did have several wives, and he did have one daughter, but given the sort of patriarchal nature of it, it was not open for his daughter to rule Islam. But since he had so many wives, he also had a lot of father-in-laws. One of his father-in-laws was a guy named Abu Bakr. Now, in fact, Abu Bakr wasn't really, since Muhammad tended to get younger wives than himself, that meant his father-in-law really wasn't that much different in age from him. And so as Muhammad got older and he became, his health was bad, he began to turn duties over to his father-in-law. It was kind of a natural thing because they were there together. And I sort of imagine it be as if Muhammad said, I don't I don't feel very good today. Why don't you go out there and tell the people to pray? Why don't you go out there and deliver this message to them and so forth? So that when he died, the basic message was, well, let him fill in for me. So that's really how the first successor was chosen. It was just mainly, it's sort of by default. It wasn't really a planned thing, like this is the way we're going to succeed things. But as Muhammad's declined, we see that his father-in-law will come into play. Now, this did not sit well with everyone. Because his father-in-law was not a direct blood relative of Muhammad, as you might suspect, many people felt the successor should be a blood relative of Muhammad. Muhammad did, like I said, had a daughter who was married to a man named Ali. Okay, Ali. Ali was a blood relative of Muhammad. This is very common in the Middle East for people to marry cousins. All right? So I'll let you discuss that amongst yourself. But they would marry cousins. I came from Kentucky, and that was also an issue there. When I got my marriage license in Kentucky, I want to go up to the desk, and I had my future wife with me. And to get the license, they start asking several questions, your name and all that kind of stuff. And then one of the questions was relation. And I said, because first they asked me my mother's name, and then they said relation. I said, well, she's my mother. I said, no, to your wife. What's your relation? I said, well, she's going to be my wife. I'll be her husband. No. What? And then she said, no, like, is she your cousin? I said, yeah, I'm in Kentucky. I mean, I actually said that, and the lady said, a lot of people say that to us. A lot of people say that. So it's a very common thing, because marriages are arranged, and they often know the people who are, say, second or third cousin. So Ali then was favored by many because he's married to Muhammad's daughter, and because their children then would be the grandchildren of Muhammad, and they eventually do have 2 sons. Okay, so this begins the rift between Islam and within Islam. Like I said at the beginning, Islam is not sort of just one thing. Sometimes people say, well, this person is a Muslim, and this is what Muslims believe. Yes, there's some common things that are there, but there's a lot of variation. Okay? Just like, say, within Christianity, where you have, say, a Roman Catholic and a hard-shell Baptist. If you know what a hard-shell Baptist is, right? Or anything in between. Those people are all Christian, but they have a lot of different views. They're not all agreeing on a lot of things. It's the same way within Islam. So you remember last time we talked about the 5 pillars of Islam and all that sort of thing. They're going to accept that sort of thing. All right? Well, let's just move for a second. I just have a map here just to remind us of the rapid expansion of Muslim control. This is going to be the second challenge. The first challenge is succession for Muhammad. The second challenge is going to be now when they rapidly take over lots of territory, that's going to change the nature of it. Prior to this, most everything had been down here in Arabia. Remember, Muhammad was from Mecca, worked in the trade that went across the desert, and a lot of things, goods coming from India, China. They would take them across to the Mediterranean, different places. He was involved in that, as were many people here, and they were all Arab. When it was here, it was all Arab people, and it was all people who were accustomed to living in the desert and working in trade and things like that. As it begins to rapidly expand, you now have other people who are incorporated into the world of Islam who are not Arab at all, like the Persians. What today would be Iran. They're not Arabs at all. Okay? Most of the Muslim world are not Arabs. It's like I always tell people, not all Arabs are Muslim, and certainly not all Muslims are Arabs. Okay? So you have to keep that in mind. So Persians have a different language, have a different culture, different background. They are brought into this. People within the Middle East, and it goes on to India, Pakistan, and it goes way beyond that. later on into Asia, where in fact the largest numbers of Muslims today are actually in the Asian world, not in the Middle East. Well, anyway, that's a discussion maybe for a different day. Now, we also see that they're moving this way, and this is really what concerns us here, is that they're moving into the sphere of the Western world that we've been talking about. We talked about the Romans and the Greeks and the Byzantines, and we've been talking about medieval Europe. So the Muslims move across North Africa in different waves, and they end up in Spain. In fact, they even move in, you can see way up there on the corner of the map, Tours. Tours. Tours is listed on your map there because of the famous Battle of Tours. Anybody remember what happened at the battle? We mentioned it earlier. It was in your reading. What happens in Tours? I already told you it's a battle. But why was that battle important? Charles Martel, right. And you remember what family or what group he's from? The Franks, exactly. Yes, so the Frankish ruler. Hey, can somebody help her with the door? There. Thanks. Thanks. Come on in. Okay. So we see that remember we talked about the Frankish people, I guess last week, and we talked about how they had a special relationship with the papacy because they were converted out of paganism straight into Western style Christianity, whereas the other people here, the Goths, the Visigoths, and so forth, they were converted to a different form of Christianity that had a diminished view of Christ, Arianism. So this is what creates a lot of the tension that we see, and so the Franks become a big ally of the papacy. All right, so Charles Martel, right? Martel is a nickname. Anybody remember what that nickname is? I'll be impressed if you do.
He's
Mayor of the palace, exactly. That's correct. Anybody know what Martel means? Remember? The Hammer, yes, exactly. Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer. He got that because, he was tough. At least they thought he was tough. And he went out, he became a kind of hero to the Western world, certainly a hero to the Pope and to other people in Western Europe. Why? Because he stops the Muslim invasion. They don't go any further. When he stops them there at the Battle of Tours, basically Islam then is contained past the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain. Okay? But Spain is going to remain Muslim for 700 plus years. All right? Until the last Muslims are driven out of Spain in 1492. It's easy to remember because you remember Columbus. 1492 is when they're pushed from the north to the south, and finally all the way across to North Africa in 1492. That's called the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain, the Christian reconquering of Spain. Okay, so Islam faces a couple of challenges. One is succession. The other is this rapid expansion. If you take a look at this, you can see that it's roughly 100 years. See that? The death of Muhammad, 632, and then we get all of this territory by 733. That's 101 years. From just having this territory right here along the coast of Arabia to having all of this territory from Pakistan to France and all the way to the Caspian Sea and pretty much everywhere in between. It's a huge amount of territory to try to deal with. It's a lot easier to conquer territory than it is to control it. Okay? And especially when they try to incorporate now, instead of before everybody was Arab, everybody spoke Arabic. And then, of course, they convert to Islam. Now people convert to Islam and they speak all different kinds of languages. They have all different kinds of cultures. How are we going to incorporate that? That is a major challenge. So Islam has been divided for quite a while. So let me just go down quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just so we get the sense of this, there are 4 successors, or they're called caliphs. 4 caliphs. The first one we talked about, Abu Bakr. He only will be the successor to Muhammad for 2 years. 2 years. Okay? from 632 to 634. He dies of natural causes. I put that up there because not all these guys do die of natural causes, right? But he does, because, he's older and he has some health problems. He dies. All right. Then, basically, it's sort of established. Again, it's not really firmly established how this happens, but he basically said that, okay, out of you 7 people, one of you will succeed me. I want you to meet together and decide sort of amongst yourselves. And he also set a time limit. I think he said 4 days. He didn't give him a lot of time. So I say, okay, well, you 5 people, you got 4 days. After I'm dead, one of you is going to do this job. So Umar, or sometimes spelled Omar, was chosen. He will rule for 10 years. He is chosen as the caliph, and he's the one who really begins the expansion. He goes out and conquers Persia. The Sasanian Empire that we talked about before had plagued the Byzantines for many years. Remember, the Byzantines were the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And he goes and conquers them. Of course, in part they had been weakened. The Sasanian Persians had been fighting against the Byzantines back and forth, so it actually had weakened both of them. And it's going to be the Muslims that are going to be able to then quickly conquer all this territory. If you ask a Muslim, why is it that Islam expanded so quickly in 100 years? You know what they'll tell you? God's will. That's what they're going to tell you. It was God's will. Allah's will. That's why we got all that land. Now, he ends up being later on assassinated by a plot of Persians, who didn't like the fact that he had conquered Persia. We'll just leave it at that. So he does not die of natural causes, right? Okay. So now, again, they've got to name another caliph. The next one is Uthman, and they've kind of fallen into a pattern that basically here early on it was people that basically who knew Muhammad, who had worked with Muhammad, who had been around since the beginning. Uthman, again, all the way along the line. Remember, Ali is alive. And many people do not think that any of these, if you talk to Shias or Shiite Muslims, they would claim that none of these are legitimate caliphs. These 4 caliphs, they reject them except for the 4th one. Now, Uthman is assassinated by rebels. These rebels are connected with those who support Ali. The question then becomes, did Ali order the assassination? A lot of people say yes. Some people say, oh no, this just happened in the course of rebellion. But nonetheless, it does put a question there for a lot of Muslims who think that, Ali was involved with this assassination. But Ali becomes then the 4th caliph in many people's minds, although there was a rival, Muawiya, who was his rival. And by the way, he will eventually, we'll see, spoiler alert, I always tell you the spoiler alerts, he's going to win out and start a dynasty. We're going to talk about the Umayyad dynasty. What happens then to Ali? Well, this rivalry comes, all right? And it's not gone just because this guy's been, in fact, it's intensified. And so it turns into, I guess what I would describe as a civil war. That is Muslim versus Muslim. Those who back Ali, those who back Uthman and his successor, Muawiya. So we see then that in 661, 5 years later, Ali dies in battle in Syria because things are moving north. They've conquered what would be Palestine, what today would be Israel, Jordan, and Syria, and Egypt. Because of the Byzantine control there was very weak, they have taken Persia. And so now we're going to see that everything's going to begin to shift to Syria, from Mecca to Damascus. Okay? So, Ali dies in battle. I think I have time to tell you this story. I've been to Damascus several times. I would not advise you going there right now. For obvious reasons. But if you go to Damascus someday, hopefully, this will probably be preserved because it's a mosque. There is a great mosque. It's called the Great Umayyad Mosque. It's in Damascus. And I remember going there the first time I ever went there, which was, I won't even tell you how long ago that was. It was a long time ago. I'm there, and they claim that they have the head of John the Baptist. Because this mosque, and we often find this in the Middle East, it's a mosque, but it had been a church, Christian church. Before that, it had been a Roman temple. Before that, it had been a pre-Roman temple to Baal. It was a temple to Baal. It was a temple to Jupiter. It was then a Christian church dedicated to John the Baptist, and then became a mosque. But you have to remember, as I told you last time, or a couple times ago, Islam has many prophets that are the same as Christianity, including John the Baptist. John the Baptist is considered a prophet within Islam. He's called Yahya. That's his name. Not John, but Yahya. That's what it's called. Sometimes I tell people my name is Yahya when I'm in the Middle East. Because they don't run too many people from the United States with that name. I tell them, well, it's John, but you call me Yahya. But they say they have his head. So you go in and you can see this great area that's all sort of boxed in with glass, and people circle it to see the place where the prophet John is buried. Now, his burial was there previously, claimed by the church that was there. But they just incorporate the church building and they expanded it. But while I was there and looking at all these things, I'd never been there before, I heard a noise. I heard a wailing, a moaning, like a, it's really, really loud. I thought, what's going on? It was more than one person. It was, 20 people at least, sort of like they're really upset. And so I start wandering that way in the mosque, because it's a huge mosque. And I see a bunch of people gathered around another, obviously, burial thing, closed like this, a stone sarcophagus. I didn't know who it was, and so I had to ask. It's the burial of Ali. Ali is there. And these people gathered around, crying like he died yesterday, were Shiite Muslims. And in fact, the Syrians have a special religion, because they're basically Shia Muslims are there. The Alawats are sort of a derivation of the Shia Muslims. And the guy who runs the Assad family, who have run Syria for a long time, they are basically Shia Muslims, and they have a connection with Iran. And that was during the time when Iran and Iraq were fighting one another. And so one of the things that the Iranian government would give to the families of those who died in battle is they would give them a trip to Damascus so they could go and see the burial place, and all the other things too, but to go to the burial place of Ali. Well, I tell you that to let you know that this is a very real thing, and it's a very present thing. It's not something that happened, 1,400 years ago to these people, 1,500 years ago. This is stuff that's very real for them, and this division is very real between the Muslims who supported Ali and those who did not. So, this leaves then Muawiyah in charge, and he is connected with Syria, and he is connected with Damascus, and he is the one then who will begin a dynasty in Damascus. Okay? So, I tell you this so that you can know that this is the basis of the division between Sunni Muslims and Shia or Shiite Muslims. And it's a division you cannot understand the Middle East, what's going on today, certainly, if you don't understand at least some basic things about this division. It's what, you have to understand what's going on in Iraq, you have to understand what's going on in Syria and other places. Because the majority of Shia Muslims live in just a few places. They're a minority of Muslims, or Shia Muslims, but they're a majority in certain countries. Well, we'll come back to that in a second. But let me just show you this map to let you show. It's a little bit better map, I think. It shows you where the Byzantines are. It shows you how they moved up in the 660s into all this territory, taking the Middle East, in Egypt, Damascus, here, Iraq, and then how they expand beyond that, 660 to 750. This is the Umayyads we're going to talk about, adding all this sort of tan or beige color all the way up to Spain. Okay? So, rapid expansion. And we've talked about, you see up there, the Frankish kingdom. That's what we talked about last time. All right, let's move on. So the Sunnis and the Shias. Let me just say a couple things about them in passing that describe their difference. Obviously, it has to do with Ali. But the Sunnis are usually considered to be more traditional. They're certainly the majority of Muslims in the world, and they accept all four caliphs, those four that I just mentioned. Okay, not Ali. Wait a minute. So they live more by the law of conscience. And in the past, when I used to do this, I would say, they were the less radical. But today, that's, there's a radicalized part of the Sunni Muslims. Right? Osama bin Laden was a Sunni Muslim. Okay? So obviously radical. Prior to that, in Iran, you had a lot, and still their Shia Muslims are very radicalized. But this is about 80% of all modern Muslims. About 80%. That's rough, but that's, so about 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 7.5 out of 10, right? We'll just say 8 out of 10. And that means about 20% are Shias. Now, again, those numbers, because there are some very small groups that we're not going to talk about today within Islam. So there's not just two groups. So what that means is, chances are, if you meet a Muslim, they're a Sunni Muslim. But you can get a better indication if you know what country they're from, because there's a majority in certain regional areas. Okay. So let's go then to the Shia Muslims. They recognize only Ali. They do not recognize the other caliphs. They say he is the true successor. And by the way, the succession would have gone, or they wanted it to go, from Muhammad to Ali, who was a cousin of Muhammad and married to his daughter, to then the grandsons of Muhammad, who were also the sons of Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad. This is about 20% of modern Muslims. Most of them are in Iran and Iraq. But there are sizable minorities of them in Yemen and Syria. So if you meet someone from, this part of the world, this is part of the problem. Saddam Hussein, for example, was a Sunni Muslim, but he's running a country that's majority Shia. See, I don't hear too many people ever talk about that, but that's a big problem. So then, if you want to have Iraq become democratic, at least try to become democratic, and you're going to vote people in, they're going to vote in Shia Muslims. And you're going to have a minority of Sunni Muslims who were highly connected in the past to Saddam Hussein and everybody else in the government, who are going to be marginalized, left out, perhaps even persecuted in retaliation for a lot of stuff that happened. So, Iraq is a big problem. In the north, you have Kurds. The rest of the country, you have mostly Shia Muslims, and then there are just certain sections in the center where you have Sunni Muslims. So this is why it's such a challenge to unify that, especially if you're going to use democracy where you're going to have a majority vote. Well, anyway, so there you go. So I say this just so you know, Islam is not all the same. There are major differences, major challenges. Now let's talk about the Umayyad dynasty just for a moment. We've already mentioned this first information, but Mu'ayyah is obviously Ali's rival. He becomes the new caliph upon Ali's death. Many people said he was the real caliph anyway. But he is connected with Syria. He had been the governor of Syria. The newly conquered Syria, of course, had Damascus. By the way, do you know that Damascus is the oldest continuously occupied city in the world? Very long history. And it was on trade routes, and so it was wealthy. So Damascus was the capital. And he begins to expand then their territory, as I showed you on that other map, as far away as the Caspian Sea, into Central Asia, and then all the way to Spain, and even beyond. So it's really during this Umayyad period that Charles Martel that we just talked about, he was dealing with those who were under this Umayyad dynasty, as you can see, lasts for roughly 90 years. Okay, let's say 90 years. By the way, you see this? This is an illustrated medieval text of the Battle of Tours. On the right side, you have the Europeans, the Franks, and on the left side you have the Moors, as they're sometimes called, the Moors or the Muslims. Really, they're Umayyad warriors. They are defeated, as we mentioned, in 732 by Charles the Hammer Martel. Pivotal turning point. Now, of course, Umayyads have been really expanding, maybe expanding sort of beyond beyond their reach. But Charles Martel stops them. He organizes it. Remember, he's not the king. He is the mayor of the palace. But of course, this goes a long way into getting him in that role. All right, so the Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers, is in France. Now, what happens then to the Umayyads? The Umayyads will eventually fall around 750. There were a lot of stories about their corruption. They're the ones that the people who don't like them, they're critics, really, I think, probably exaggerated their excesses, but I'm sure they had some excesses along the way. Remember, we said, what did we say about what Muslims can eat and drink? Any restrictions? Remember that? We talked about it. I know it's been a couple of weeks. It might even been before spring break. You remember? Is a Muslim going to order a bacon cheeseburger? No? Somebody shaking their head no. Why not? Can't eat pork. Exactly. Exactly. Yes. A lot of the laws, they're not identical to Jewish dietary laws. So I don't want you to think they're exactly the same. But that's a good guideline. If you sort of know what's kosher, then that gives you a good hint as to what's halal. Halal, it's called. Halal is what's lawful for a Muslim to eat. Definitely pork is not allowed in either case. Shellfish, like shrimp and stuff like that, are not allowed in either case. All right, but also remember, for a Muslim, they're not to drink any alcohol. Alcohol is prohibited. So, what did they say about the Umayyads? They said not only did the Umayyads drink wine, and lots of it, they said that they had in their palace bathing, pools, swimming pools, filled with wine, and that these guys would swim around in it, and drink it while they're swimming around. Now, I think that's probably an exaggeration, okay? But it's supposed to point out the fact these guys were decadent. They were just doing all kinds of things they weren't supposed to do, right? All kinds, pursuing all kinds of women they weren't supposed to do, all kinds of alcohol, and different kinds of pleasure. They were not being true to Islam. And remember, Islam means what? Remember what it means? Islam and Muslim come from the same root word. We talked about it. Islam. Should I keep pausing? I think people are Googling it now. It means submission. Submission. To submit to Allah, to submit to God. So Islam means submission. Muslim means the one who submits, or the one who's in the process of submitting, because you're never fully submitted. Okay? So they weren't doing that. And therefore, the critics say they should have fallen, and they do fall. All right, so here's a lot of their territory, not all of it. But you see they get all of North Africa over into Spain, and the Muslim expansion there. Okay, let's move on. The Abbasids. Again, this is just a thumbnail sketch of these civilizations. The Abbasid dynasty, 750 to 1258. All right, so that's a long time, right? 300, 400, 500 years. The capital then is moved from Damascus during this period. They build a brand new capital city called Baghdad. You've probably heard of it. Baghdad. Baghdad is close to, we studied ancient Babylon. It's not exactly the same city as Babylon. It's not far from there. And they built the new capital of Baghdad. It becomes a real center of culture and learning, which might surprise some people. Now, if we want to pick the ruler who's of the sort of the golden age, you know, the one that is most memorable, flamboyant, it would be this guy right here. His name is Harun al-Rashid. Now, you might think he's a wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings, Harun al-Rashid, but no, he is actually this ruler. As I show you these pictures of people through the semester, I've told you a couple things. First of all, you're going to get names for your baby, your upcoming babies, a lot of baby names or pet names. The other thing, of course, we see a lot of interesting hats. There's a hat for you right there. This reminds me of something you probably never had, Jiffy Pop popcorn. You even know what I'm talking about? You do. A couple of you do. There you go. So go down to wherever, Publix, and get yourself, I don't know if they sell it there, Jiffy Pop popcorn. It's in a little aluminum pan. You pop it up right there. It's very exciting. And then the thing just grows and it gets a top on it. It looks a lot like that. You tear it open and you got hot, delicious popcorn. Jiffy Pop popcorn. It's a commercial for which I get no remuneration, not even a free package. Well, this is the golden age. Harun, by the way, anybody know what Harun is? Harun's a very famous name in the Bible. Sounds a little like the name. The brother of Moses. Who's the brother of Moses? Maybe that's a tougher question. Aaron, yes. Ask my brother Aaron. He knows how to talk, right? Harun is the Islamic way to say Aaron. Okay, so Harun, Aaron, al-Rashid. Rashid has to do with the head, the chief. Well, anyway, this is the golden age. Now, one interesting event that sort of ties it in with what we've been talking about, we were talking about Charlemagne before, is that he is a ruler at the same time. Remember, he's contemporary. Remember Charlemagne is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor in 800. Well, he's a ruler. So Harun al-Rashid gets word that, hey, there's this new leader over there and somewhere in Europe, and you know, of course, he's got a huge empire compared to Charlemagne. So he decides, I should send him a gift now that he's an emperor, And so he sends him an elephant. I don't know what Charlemagne ever does with this elephant, or how many elephants he had ever seen, but an elephant is shipped to Charlemagne from Baghdad, from that area. I would like to know more about that elephant, but I haven't had the chance to try to track it. I don't know how much we do know. But he sends the elephant to him as a gift. That's why I put that little elephant right there. I don't know why I just thought. Now, this points out, as I often tell people, if you were sick, if you had a bad disease, you'd be far better off to be in Baghdad in 800 than to be in Paris or anywhere in Europe. Right? Because they had a lot better medical care, had a lot better doctors, they had a lot better scholars. And I point that out just to let you know that this is really a golden age. I mean, it's an age of enlightenment, if you will, an age of learning. Now, there starts to be fractures within the Islamic world. First, we have the Shia-Sunni thing. Then, remember, we had the Umayyads. The Umayyads are defeated, and we see the capital goes to the Abbasids. However, what you got to remember is those Muslims over in North Africa and Spain are still basically affiliated with the old Umayyad way of doing things. They are not affiliated with the Abbasids. And then within the Abbasids' rule in Egypt, they begin to have trouble about 973 with a group known as the Fatimids. The Fatimids are a Shiite rival of the Sunni Abbasids. But they basically are able to break away and start their own separate government, if you will, of Egypt and the surrounding area. So I like to say that Islam has been fragmented almost since the beginning. It's not been unified. Sunni, Shias, now politically it's divided between parts of Spain and North Africa, Egypt, and now Three. Got at least three Islamic governments. So it's not unified at this point. All right? Let's see what we got next. Oh, another map. This showing you where the Fatimids are. You can see that they end up taking control not only of Egypt, but eventually they're going to take control of Syria and the holy cities, Medina and Mecca. So they control the holy cities. There are three holy cities to Islam. We mentioned Mecca and Medina. What's the third most holy city of all of Islam? I mentioned it before. It's a famous city. I know you've heard of it. Jesus visited this city. Well, Jerusalem, yeah, of course. Jerusalem. And I told you before that in the beginning, Muslims prayed towards Jerusalem. They did not pray towards Mecca. Not until they took Mecca. Mecca was not in their thing. Once Mecca is incorporated and the Jews basically reject Muhammad as their prophet, then he switches things around and they pray towards Mecca. All right. So we see this is this map. Let's see what we got next. Okay, let's talk about the Turks. Just briefly. Again, we're just sort of briefly doing this. Now, the Seljuk Turks. I specify the Seljuk Turks because there are several different subgroups of Turks. Where do the Turks come from? The Turks come from the northern part of Central Asia. So what do I mean? The areas north of India. A lot of those countries are have the ending of Stan. I call them the Stan countries, right? Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. Kazakhstan. Those, by the way, Stan is a Muslim ending that means the country of, more or less, right? So, from up in that north of the Himalayas, Central Asia, that's where the Turks come from. How do they get to the Middle East? They're actually brought in by the Abbasids around 850 as mercenary soldiers, because these guys are great warriors. They ride on horseback, and they can sweep in and take people out, conquer. So they're excellent warriors. Now, what you got to be careful of is that, when you ask people to come help you, is that sometimes it can backfire on you down the road. And that's what happens here. As the Abbasids got weaker, the Turks got stronger. And in fact, they will eventually capture Baghdad in 1055. And of course, as you know, we have a country called Turkey today. And there was, prior to that, a huge empire called the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled by the Turks, especially the Seljuk Turks at first, and then the Osmali Turks. All right, so they are Sunni with a strict interpretation of Islam. For example, they take this fine building. I hope someday you get to see that building, because it's one of my favorites. This is called the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia, or wisdom, holy wisdom. This was a church built by Justinian in the 6th century, and it's still standing. It was the largest church structure in the world until St. Peter's Basilica was completed, about 1,000 years later. And once the Muslims take over, they convert it into a mosque. All right? Today, it's officially a museum. So it's not a mosque, nor a church. It's a tourist site, I guess you might say. It's a museum. But they still have left up the Islamic medallions to cover up the mosaics of various scenes of, Jesus and Mary and other things like that. So there's mosaics up there on the wall. You can see some of them, but a lot of them are covered with these medallions. Now, these Seljuk Turks will eventually attack the Byzantines in 1071. And we are going to talk about probably, either later this week or next week, we're going to talk about the Crusades. The Crusades get prompted because the Byzantines are being attacked by Muslims. Right? They want help. But those Muslims are Seljuk Turks. They want help fighting Turks in what we would call Turkey today. The Crusades, though, turn into a conquest, of the Holy Land to fight against Muslims that are not Turks. They are in fact Fatimids, and so it kind of all gets mixed up there in the mix. But this is what ends up prompting the call for help from the Byzantine Emperor to the West. Please send me troops to help me fight the Muslims who are trying to take over my territory. Now, they do not take Constantinople until much, much later. Now, what are some other developments that take place in this part of the world that are going to have an impact? We see there's the Mongol invasion. Right? Those of you who've been watching those little videos I have you watch, right? He always mentions the Mongols in every one of them, doesn't he? Except for the Mongols. Now, the Mongols will come across from the Gobi Desert from Asia. At first, they're wiping out Muslims, but eventually they convert to Islam. They seize Persia and Mesopotamia. And so that takes a big chunk of that territory away. And so we see that the Seljuk Turks then control Turkey. They control some of that area. The Egyptians are controlled by Muslims that are called Mamluks. And as the Mamluks decline, we'll see that the Ottoman Empire will expand down into the Middle East, down into Egypt, and then across North Africa, so that the Ottoman Empire will in fact end up being a huge empire from Europe, from basically Albania and Yugoslavia, Herzegovina, Serbia, all the way around to the Caspian Sea, down into Iraq, and even Iran, and across Egypt and across North Africa. But it's not until 1453 that the Ottoman Turks, which are really the Osmani Turks, not the Seljuk Turks, capture Constantinople in 1453. What does that mean? That means that really you could say the Roman Empire in the East continues in some fashion until 1453. It's a long time, right? That's over 1,000 years. Remember, Constantine sets that up as a capital around 330 AD, and it remains a Western Christian capital until 1453. With the capture of this, it really gives, credibility to the Ottomans. They now have a major city as their capital. And they changed the name from Constantinople to Istanbul. But, Istanbul really just means this is the city. The city, Anyway, 1453. All right. Well, a lot more we could say there, but we better move on. All right. Now I want to talk about just a few things to help us understand Islam and its relationship with Christianity, because increasingly in the medieval world, this was a very real interaction, right? The Muslims were not only all over the Middle East, they were right in Spain. This is in part what helps to prompt the Crusades. The Crusades, for example, when you talk to people about the Crusades, there's a kind of interpretation some people have that's completely negative about the Crusades, right? This is terrible, of Western people going in and killing Muslims. If you take a look at the way the Europeans looked at it, however, and this is the way sort of a newer interpretation now, let's analyze the event from the perspective of the people who were doing it rather than us now. They saw this not as going in and conquering the Muslims and taking over their territory. They saw it as reclaiming the land the Muslims had taken from the Christians. Just like the Spanish thought it was a reconquista in Spain, the Crusaders thought it was a reconquista, only not in those words, of the Middle East, because that had been the heart of Christianity. Right? Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Damascus, these are all Christian cities. Well, anyway, we'll talk about the Crusades a little more later, but I just wanted to bring it up there. So to really kind of understand the mindset, though, of the Muslim and of Islam, the first thing you got to remember is this. Whereas in the United States, we are keenly attempt, anyway, to separate church and state. I think sometimes, in my opinion, too much. You know, the government's not supposed to create a religion, but I personally don't think the original founders wanted to remove religion from the government completely. I think they didn't want the government to control religion, but I don't think they intended for religion to not have any influence on government. At any rate, within Islam, that is not an issue at all. There is no separation, if we want to call it the church, or the mosque, or Islam, religion, and the state. In fact, if you said something like that to a Muslim, I talked to them about it, they just can't understand why you would want to. Why would you want to remove religion from the government? Why? I mean, isn't your religion important to you? Doesn't it shape your values and so on and so forth? Why would you want to remove that from your government? Okay? So for them, it's not even an issue. They don't even really talk about it. I put it up here because it's an issue for us. Now, the other thing you have to remember within Islam, and I think we understand that in the church, there's the idea of sort of us and them, right? We sometimes talk about church people, or maybe we talk about pagan and Christian. You know, that's a pagan, or that's secular, and this is Christian, right? We kind of see a dichotomy in the world. There's the church, and then there's the non-church, right? Yeah, I think we do. They do that in Islam as well. There are those who are Muslims and those who are non-Muslims. It's a real dichotomy. They call the people who are Muslims and that Muslim community the Ummah. The Ummah. It should be the community of all Muslims that's around the world, the Ummah. So you're either a part of the Ummah or you're not. Now, I would make a joke about Uma Thurman right now, but I don't think you have any idea who she is. Anybody here know who that is? No. Okay. I used to, but it's 2 or 3 people. Okay. So you remember Uma? Right? She made some movies. She was like a guy named Bill in a couple of those movies. Anyway, a lot of times I make the jokes just for me anyway. And, you know, a lot of people don't get them. They just sit there. But, you know, it's just kind of for me. It's just part of the... I got to get it out. All right. Now, the religious leader, the other thing you got to remember about Islam, if we try to make sort of a parallel with Christianity, there are some parallels, but there are some distinctions. First of all, within Islam, there is no paid clergy or paid ministers, or however you want to look at it. No staff. There is no mosque staff, you know, where they got the youth minister or the youth imam of the mosque or something. That none of that is paid. There are people that are working. There are people who teach. There are people who are preaching and that sort of thing. But none of it is paid. Okay? So the mosque building itself. Also, you don't have like we have, most churches have, a church treasurer. Right? And you have, maybe you pass a plate. I don't know how you do it at your church. Maybe you pass a plate, or you have a box at the back. Or if you really don't trust people, you put a little round thing with a bag on it. It has a long stick on it. You just wave it out in front of people so that they can't, you know, take something out. Or like we used to do in Kentucky, you use KFC buckets. You just get empty KFC buckets and pass them. That way you got plenty of room for all the money. Well, they don't have any of that. There is no collection taken up. There is no treasurer. You don't get a statement at the end of the year, this is how much you gave to the church. Your giving is to be personal and individual. You are supposed to give, but you don't give it sort of through the organization of the mosque. That makes sense? So, because they're not paying any clergy. Now, it doesn't mean that the imams don't get any benefits. They do. They get food, they get other perks, they get things. But that's personally somebody giving them something in gratitude. It's not a salary or however you want to look at it. Okay. Now, another thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention before when we talked about Islam was slavery. I mention this because I've had in the past students and others who have said to me something to this effect: Christianity is a slavery religion and Islam is not. I've had more than one person tell me that. That's simply not factual. Okay? There's lots of slavery within Islam. It's widespread. In fact, where did the Europeans get the idea of slave trade? From the Muslims. They were buying slaves from the Muslims before they were involved in slave trade. So I just want to make that clear. The slave trade for the Muslims was basically from Africa, but it was from the other side. It was from the east side of Africa. The eastern part of Africa was heavily used for slave trade by Muslims, whereas the Europeans eventually are on the west side of that. All right? But slavery is widespread in the Islamic world. Now, the caveat was you could not enslave a Muslim. I don't know how much they told the people they were talking, they were capturing. Hey, by the way, if you convert to Islam, you can't become a slave. It really wasn't an issue. Slavery was widespread. For example, when I go to Jordan, I've been to Jordan many times, down in what's called the Gore, and not Al Gore, down in the Gore, which is the valley of the Jordan River and down to the Dead Sea. So from the Dead Sea to the Sea of Galilee, as we would call it in the Bible, there is a valley, the Jordan Valley. And it is very deep. In fact, the Dead Sea, when you're standing on the shore of the Dead Sea, you're standing at the lowest spot on the face of the earth. Okay? Can't get anywhere lower and not go under the ocean. So it's very hot. Because it's hot in the Middle East anyway, but it's really hot down there. They would grow tropical plants down there. Sugar cane, bananas, all that kind of stuff. Okay? Date palms. They used slave labor. The Muslims used a lot of slave labor when they began to cultivate sugar cane, especially. And then they would grow the sugar cane, and then of course, sugar cane, I don't know if you know anything about it, it has to be planted thick, cut down, thrown into big vats and boiled. Very hard work, very hot work. So still down in that area today, there are the people who live in that valley, the Gore, G-H-O-R, Gore. They're called the Goreem by the local people, the Goreem. They're very small people, short, thin, very dark skinned. Because they are the descendants of the slaves who were there. Well, anyway, so the slaves were for sub-Saharan Africa, but on the east side. I just point that out in order to bring it up because it has come up before. Slavery, unfortunately, was a part of Islam, and it was a part of Islam for a long time. Any questions about any of this? I don't know if I'm moving too fast. Sometimes I get too wound up. Okay. I'm still recovering from the weekend. That's all right. People see me, maybe have you stand up and do jumping jacks. I don't usually do that kind of thing. It seems like it today. Everybody's kind of, All right, that's okay. We'll keep going. Another thing I wanted to talk about as it relates to Europe, because we're kind of looking at how Islam relates back into the Western world, and the medieval world in particular. One of the things I think a lot of people maybe don't know or don't fully appreciate is that much of the learning of the Greco-Roman world, the classical world, was lost in Western Europe. Remember we said some people called that period the Dark Ages, although that's not a very popular thing to call them today. Because in one essence they were not dark. But there was a lot of things that were lost. A lot of writings. And a lot of people didn't know how to read or write, and a lot of things were not preserved. Well, what happened to those things? Were they just gone? No. They were taken into the Islamic world. In fact, for example, in different periods of time, elements of the Greco-Roman world were banished by Christian rulers. For example, during the time of Justinian, he believed that the philosophical school in Plato, that Plato had started in Athens, the school of philosophy, was really rooted in paganism, and so he shut it down. Where did a lot of those people go? They went to places like Baghdad. Okay? So that a lot of the learning that was once in Athens and Rome, and a lot of the writings that were preserved there, the writings that were there, like Euclid's geometry and so on, these things were taken into the Islamic world. They weren't just preserved. I got here that they preserves it. Yes, they preserves it, but it also greatly expands it. Because preserved, maybe I should change that word. It makes it think like, oh, they just locked it up in a vault, and then later on we take it out and we hand it back to people. It's not that. They actually take that learning and they expand upon it. One of the things that they expand upon are in the area of mathematics and philosophy. So we've got, Aristotle and Plato. We talked about them much earlier in the class. We didn't mention Euclid, but his writings are the basis of geometry. So if you're a geometry fan, you can thank Euclid. If you're not a geometry fan, I should blame him. But within the Islamic world, by the way, there was a lot of practical uses or needs for mathematics. Remember, let me ask you this. Now, a Muslim, if they get ready to pray, what do they need to do to get prepared? What are some of the steps? You remember? They just sit down and pray somewhere? We talked about it. What would be the difference between, say, maybe your devotional prayer and a Muslim's devotional prayer?
Does it have to be in a certain place?
It has to be, well, it could be anywhere, but you're right. They often go to the mosque. They can pray anywhere. But you're right, it has to be towards a certain place. You remember that?
A certain direction?
Yes. I think that's what you meant. Towards Mecca. So that means that no matter where you are, you've got to figure out where is Mecca. So that means you need to know, not only like now, which direction am I facing, but which direction is Mecca? Is it here? Is it there? If I'm supposed to pray, if it's time for me to pray, and I say, okay, I got to pray towards Mecca, I got to figure out where Mecca is. Now, today, on my iPhone, I've got a little somewhere on here, I got a little compass. I don't know where it's hidden on here, because I don't use it very often. There it is. So right now, there's east. Right there. But Mecca's not east. Mecca is more from here southeast. I don't know the exact degrees, right? But basically, I'd have to be praying that direction. Something like that. Between there and there. All right? But I'd have to be able to figure that out without an iPhone. So, and so that means that mathematically they began to work different ways to tell directions, different ways to figure out angles, because you're also to pray 5 times a day. And part of that is telling what time it is during the day. So being able to tell the time, being able to tell directions, a lot of these things become essential part of their daily worship. So there's a lot of practical uses for geometry that maybe you don't find in your life that they did. All right? So today, as I told you, I'm sure there's an app. I don't have one. But there would be an app you could download that would tell you all those things. The prayer times, the angles. I know there's a website called the Virtual Muezzin. You log into that, you put in your zip code, it will tell you where is the closest mosque to you. It will tell you what are the times of prayer for today, and so on. Okay? So, geometry is there. Now let me ask you this too. Do you know Roman numerals? Any football fans? We had a Super Bowl recently, right? What was the Super Bowl? What was it? 50? Was it 50?
51.
51. And so how is 51 represented, though, on all the logos? Oh, now it sounds getting tougher, right? It's going to be in a math class. L-I? Yes, L-I. Exactly. So that's Roman numerals, right? The straight up, the I is 1, 2 of them is 2, 3 of them is 3, 4 is a V with a 1 in front of it.
Unless it's a piece of the clock.
Yes? V is a 5. Let me ask you this. How in Roman numerals do you represent 0? It's a trick question. There is no 0. You know why? Because the Greco-Romans didn't even have a concept of 0. And the word 0 is actually an Arabic term. It comes from the word zif, for 0 or nothing. Within the Islamic world, including into India and so forth, they developed the idea of 0, the idea of negative numbers, the idea of sort of numbers in between numbers. And between 1 and 2, there's a gradation, right? Fractions are 1.897, right? So forth. So that's a completely new concept that was not, I'll just give you one example, a completely new concept that was not in the Greco-Roman world. That when it reemerges during the Renaissance and so forth in Europe, is now this whole idea of 0, the idea of negative numbers, and the idea of algebra. You know, if you find almost any word in English that starts with AL, it comes from Arabic. And a lot of them are chemical or mathematical. Right? Algorithm, algebra, alcohol. I don't think it's more than I said algorithm, didn't I? Yeah. Well, there might be a few more. Alchemy, yeah, that's also an Arabic word. Because A-L in Arabic is the definite article. It means the. The. Let's say, al-kitab means the book. Okay. So, algebra, the concept of 0. These actually come into English as our words. The very words we use are really from Arabic sources, but it reveals that these ideas came out of the Arabic world, or out of the Muslim world, out of places like Baghdad. Also, many advances in medicine, botany, chemistry, astronomy, things that we don't even think, for example, if you look up at the night sky, most of those constellations were actually first named by Muslim astronomers. And even a lot of the names are still preserved that way. Or they've been translated into Latin from that. Okay? For example, the wise men came from the east, right? They were astronomers. So astronomy has a long history all the way back to the Babylonians, but it makes its way up through the Islamic world as well. Now, how about this? I know there's some of you in this room. I know. I'm not one of you. But you're addicted to what I call the bean. You're addicted to the bean. Coffee. You stand in line. I've seen people snake out of that all the way to the Jesus fountain, waiting for a coffee and a bagel. Now, both of those, the coffee comes from the Middle East. By the way, bagels do not. We associate them with Jews, and that's correct, but it had nothing to do with the Middle East. That was invented in New York. I remember being in Jerusalem a long time ago, reading an ad, a long time ago, and it said, now, for the first time in Jerusalem, genuine New York bagels. Bagels were invented in Eastern Europe, and they moved to New York, and they're perfected there, I guess, but then they were brought back into Israel, Jerusalem. But coffee comes from this part of the world. The coffee beans originate in the southern part of Arabia, and the eastern part, they were also cultivated in the eastern part of Africa. And that's where they came from. And coffee becomes a main part of the Islamic culture. Remember, they can't drink alcohol. So the men go and hang out in coffee shops, coffee houses. You think think that invented in Seattle, Starbucks? No. That was a long tradition in the Middle East. Men typically men, would go there and hang out. In fact, there were a lot of laws that governed the drinking of coffee because they felt that it led to trouble if you drank coffee, and that it incited political things as well. So coffee, by the way, is first introduced to the Western world when the Ottoman Turks, on more than one occasion, tried to attack Vienna, Austria. On the first attempt of them attempting to attack Austria, they got word that the Mongols were coming into Turkey from the east. And so they quickly left, and they just left stuff behind, and they took off because they needed to go out and defend their territory. And when they left giant sacks of coffee beans. And so it was people in Vienna that first got those coffee beans. And once they did, they wanted more. So the oldest coffee houses in the West are in Vienna. Okay? The Vienna coffee. All right, these are just a few things. I don't know, what do I have next? Oh, yes. Just a word about art and architecture, because we're just about out of time. How much time do we have left? 4 minutes. Okay. One of the things I don't know if I told you before, maybe I mentioned it, but I want to make sure we're clear, is just like we read in the Bible, in the Old Testament, right? They were not supposed to have idols. Right? It goes all the way back to the Ten Commandments. You shouldn't have graven images. Within Islam, they have a prohibition on images. In fact, probably wider than anybody else you know. You weren't supposed to have any images, and certainly not inside a mosque. For many, not anywhere. And so some who strictly when cameras and so forth became popular early on, that became a big issue because now I could take your picture and I have your image and I created a graven image of you, and what am I going to do with that image and so forth. This is why this is still an issue for some people today, different parts of the world, but certainly for Muslims. So what does that mean? A lot of the artwork that we see in the Western world has to do with all kinds of images, right? People, animals, and so forth, other living creatures. These things were prohibited within Islam. Now, I'm not saying it never happened. It did happen. But they wasn't supposed to happen. You're certainly not going to find it in a mosque. So what that means then is they begin to use geometric designs in very interesting ways. Things like hexagons, triangles, loops, repeating patterns. Since images are prohibited, they decorate with often repeating geometric signs, symbols, things like that. So these geometric designs, and the other thing is calligraphy. So for example, a lot of times you go into a mosque, and a mosque normally has a dome like you see here. They have a dome because a dome provides a big open space, and it makes a big open space for prayer. But you go in there, especially in that dome that's circular, and you'll see all the way around the top, all the way around the edge, there will be decoration, but it's actually a verse from the Quran, or maybe a couple of verses from the Quran. It will be writing very ornate calligraphy of Arabic. And I've asked Muslims sometimes, what verse is that? What does that say? And they say, I can't read it. It's too elaborate. So it's not meant to be read. It's a decoration. And they use that. Now, of course, the mosque becomes the central feature that we have. And let me just put this all up here. It's a central feature that we have, and it becomes a central architecture and artwork. Sometimes they take an old building and convert it like this one. But you'll always see a mihrab. You see that thing right there? Kind of looks like a door. It's not a door. But that marks, remember I said we had to figure out which way to pray to Mecca. That marks the way of prayer. That's the doorway to prayer. And in fact, if you look at a prayer rug, it'll have a little arch like that with a lamp hanging down. That's your doorway to prayer, and the lamp is the light that you get from God, that sort of thing. The minaret you see up here was functional, but it becomes architectural. It's where the muezzin would go up and do the call to prayer. They used to do it by manually, up there. They would sing-song. They have a sing-song way they do it. Now, of course, it's done with speakers, and it used to be done with a microphone with a guy live. Now they've got it taped. A lot of them are recorded. And I would call the people to prayer. So I think this is my last one. It just shows you the mihrab. The minbar is basically the pulpit. And here's some of the calligraphy in the medallion and some of the other things that have to do with the architecture here. I'll be posting all this stuff on MyFire. I hope you guys have a good day. We better end it there because we're out of time. Take care.